I guess, in that order. First, on the essence of rebuttals. What are rebuttals? Rebuttals are basically just responses to an argument. But there are obviously multiple different ways that you can formulate a response to an argument, and multiple categories of a response that you can group, I guess, responses into. In the end, the essence of a rebuttal comes down to the question of weighing. Your role is to try and prove why your team's case is more important than another team's case. And your case is a formulation of arguments, setup, and responses. So it's not just your arguments against one another, it's also the arguments after those rebuttals, but also your quality of rebuttals as well. This is particularly important in BP debating, where teams can win by just responding in some instances with maybe one argument, especially when you're weighing multiple different teams against each other. It becomes a lot more messy, which is why your case can be built purely on a response, but it can also, in many cases, be built both through a response and an argument. And I guess the majority of cases are like responses and arguments, but know that your case is a formulation of both. When taking notes for rebuttal, there are two ways that you can take it. Well, I guess there are two common conventions of taking notes. The first is you get a piece of paper, you draw a line down the middle, and you write arguments on the left side, and you write rebuttals on the right side. The second is that you just take down arguments one by one and keep a lot of space in order for you to think of responses. The one thing I don't want you guys to end up doing is condensing everything into a very small set of lines. Because the problem with that is that when you condense everything, you might think of a response later on to an argument that was said earlier, and you might not be able to find space to write it down in your notes. So always keep a bunch of extra space after you're done thinking of your initial responses in order for you to be able to come back later and maybe think of other responses. And sometimes you might not be able to think of responses to arguments, but it's important that you try in some sense or another. And if you can't think of those responses at this point, still note down the argument and then keep a bunch of space so that maybe like in minute 5 or minute 6 of someone's speech, you'll be able to think of a response and then write down the responses there. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
Just keep a bunch of space. Space is generally quite good. I guess the same applies even if you're doing this. So if you're writing an argument on the left side and rebuttal on the right side, keep a bunch of space on the right side in order for you to be able to think of responses and rebuttals. Generally, there are numerous responses that you can come up with. Also, importantly, track down all arguments that a speaker is providing. Something that a lot of debaters end up doing is that you only respond to like 1 or 2 points in your speech, but note down everything that they're responding to. And also, importantly, note down the responses that they provide to your case and the responses that you can provide to those responses. Because it's very common, I guess a common analogy of a debate is that it's similar to a ping pong ball when you're playing table tennis, for example, which is that you think of a response to their case, they respond to your response, you're then supposed to respond back to their response. So obviously try to respond to both arguments and rebuttal. So maybe note down their rebuttals in a different page, maybe note down their rebuttals here and then write down your responses to that here. But find a note convention that helps you, and obviously this varies based on what you find more comfortable. Yeah.
I find myself having difficulty writing down every single one of their arguments.
This is why bullet points are incredibly important, especially if you're a responsive speaker. You're not going to be able to write down everything in lines or full sentences. So knowing what the argument is, are they arguing this results in inequality? Then just write down inequality and then think of responses, because you probably know what they're saying because you remember what they were talking about. You don't need to write down their entire case, nor will you be able to read out their entire case when you're providing a speech. So just write down bullet points, 1 or 2 words perhaps, maybe a phrase, and then you get what their argument is, and then you'll be able to think of responses to their argument. Works? Okay. Now let's get into responses and rebuttals more theoretically. There are 3 kinds of rebuttals that you're able to employ in a debate. The first is what we call direct engagement or nullification. The second is mitigation, and the third is split. How many of you have heard these terms at some point in your debating career? Okay, great. Direct engagement or nullification. Wait, which ones are you familiar with? Which ones are you not familiar with?
Mitigation.
Okay, you're familiar with mitigation?
Yeah, I'm familiar with mitigation.
Okay. Do you guys know what a flip is?
Like you flip the argument to make it oppose.
Like
the
place
other
it in
side
your
and-
own model.
Yeah,
Place
yeah.
it in your
Okay.
own
And then make it better for yourself.
Yep. There are a few ways that you can conceptualize these 3 things. There is obviously a difficulty reward trade-off here. That is, obviously a flip is the most beneficial. Actually, since some people might not know what these responses are at face, we'll just quickly talk about that. Direct engagement is just responding to the logic of an argument. It's basically saying this argument is wrong for X, Y, and Z reasons. That is, they say this happens, this actually doesn't happen for whatever reason that you're able to think of. Mitigation is reducing the value of the argument in the context of a debate. There are two ways you can mitigate an argument. We'll chat about that a bit later. And flipping is basically trying to claim the argument on your side. So for example, they say this reduces inequality. You say no, this actually increases inequality for these reasons, and then you use their logic against them. A flip is basically claiming a benefit that the other side is trying to claim on your side of the house, if that makes sense. Make sense to everyone? Okay. Those are the three kinds of responses at a theoretical level. Obviously, there is a difficulty reward trade-off here. That is, a mitigation is probably easier to do than direct responses relative to a flip. And the reason why is because a mitigation is just reducing the value of an argument. And you can reduce the value of an argument by just saying they exaggerate the impacts of this argument. Like my POI to Scarlett was probably, like if I can remember correctly, it was that there are numerous other ways that you can introduce indigenous culture to people in Australia. Why is this the most important one? In particular, as an elder, if it comes at the cost of lives, for example, or the safety of citizens. So just mitigate the value of the argument. They're like, well, this leads to cultural cohesion. There are other ways to get cultural cohesion. Why is this the most important? So mitigation just reduces the value of an argument. And it's always pretty easy for you to be able to think of mitigation to other teams' arguments. Because like in lots of cases, debaters exaggerate their arguments. They exaggerate both the likelihood and the impact of their argument. So if you can just gut check them, this just reduces the value of the argument writ large. The second is direct response. Direct response is slightly harder than mitigation because you need to look at the logic of that argument and think about where that argument is faulty. So at which point in the analytical chain are they wrong, and where are you able to cut off an argument? This is obviously a bit harder to do, especially when you get into good rooms where teams are pretty good at making arguments, which means you won't be able to prove that the argument is not true. The job you then have to do as a second and third speaker is just prove that the argument is not valuable in the debate. And I guess this is also I guess in some sense representative of the quality of room that you're in. So if you're in a really bad room at a tournament, they might make really bogus arguments that you can very easily respond to by going, well, this is obviously not true for this, this, and this reason. But if teams have time and prep to be able to think of arguments, if you're debating at a big comp, for example, teams will know that their arguments are true. You just have to reduce the importance of that argument. The third is a flip. The flip is the hardest response that you can think, the hardest category of a response for you to be able to use. That's not to say that a flip is impossible. Lots of very good debates have very good flips. We might get to an example if we have time. The world's 2025 semi-final speech, which was basically a deputy speech purely of flipping. They were like, well, this is wrong. It's far worse on their side for this reason. So it's not impossible to flip an argument. It's just the hardest way for you to respond to an argument. But the reward is obviously the highest because you're able to claim a benefit on your side. You're no longer just taking out an argument or reducing the value of an argument. You're claiming that the argument is false and more prevalent on your side of the house. So if they say this increases purchasing power for poorer individuals within the state, if you're able to prove, well, no, this just worsens purchasing power, then you're obviously able to claim a sizable harm on their side of the house that you can then weigh on later in second and third speeches. Okay, let's talk about mitigation. There are two ways for you to mitigate an argument. The first way for you to mitigate an argument is to mitigate on the question of importance. So some of you might remember this diagram from a few weeks ago, or I guess at this point a few months ago. An argument is judged on two metrics. The first is likelihood, the second is impact. Last week we talked about both of these a bit more in depth. We proved how you can increase the likelihood of an argument by filling in the analytical chain to make the argument. And we also proved that you're supposed to impact the argument at the end of that analytical chain. So an argument is judged on those two metrics. The way you mitigate an argument is by either reducing the likelihood of the argument or reducing the impact of that argument. Okay, the scales here are a bit weird. The reason the scales here are a bit weird is I asked Gemini AI to generate these pictures, and they're very bad at drawing graphs apparently. I don't know.
Yeah, they are.
I didn't know that. Anyways, essentially the likelihood of an argument increases as you go to this side, and the impact of an argument increases as you go up the y-axis. So you're just either trying to reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact of that argument, and therefore be able to reduce the value of an argument. You can, like, as a rough heuristic, you can think of the value of an argument as likelihood into impact. So basically just the square that an argument encompasses on this metaphysical plane of whatever sort this is. But that's basically what an argument is. Or I guess the value of an argument is. Okay. Yeah. When you're mitigating an argument, especially at schools tournaments where judges might be a bit less experienced and might discredit your argument, it's important to flag your response as a mitigation. So you can say, I'm first going to mitigate this argument by doing this, proving that it's unlikely that they're able to claim a sizable impact as a result of cultural exposure, for example. So use the word mitigation, because one of the things that judges love to do, especially like less experienced judges, is that they would love to discredit an argument by saying, well, this argument doesn't respond to the argument that they're saying. The argument I still believe at the end of the day coming from affirmative or whatever. That's a very easy way for them to cop out of having to do the hard analytical work of deciding which team wins. So obviously in those situations, explain what your response does. So there are two parts to make your response. Give the response, explain what the response does. So this responds to their argument directly. This mitigates their argument. This flips their argument. So just use those words and you'll be fine as in like bad rooms. Alright. The second is direct engagement. Direct engagement is just proving that the logic of the argument is wrong. You guys do this a lot anyways, and I think this is the most common response employed, I guess, in these classes. You just say, well, this is untrue for this, and this reason. That's a fine way to approach responses. But the problem with that is that you have a lot of responses on the table that you're just never able to claim because you're far too honed in on thinking of a direct response, which is why employ more mitigation and less direct response. Because, like, let's be honest, most teams, the arguments they're saying are probably true. Like, it's probably true and somewhat important in some situations. The question is just, this could also be flipped. This is fair. We will get to a flip example in a second. But direct engagement is just like proving it's wrong. Let's take the motion. This House believes that the West should introduce a complete ban on the purchase of Russian oil and natural gas. Affirmative says this pressures Russia into ending the war because their economic the economy crashes, oligarchs pressure Putin, etc., etc. You can say, no, they sanction-proof their economy, they have sufficient trading partners that they're able to trade with anyways. So this doesn't do that. And then you can win on all of the other reasons why doing this is a horrible idea. Does that make sense? Okay. Something that I guess less experienced teams do, going back to this, is that they might be able to respond to an argument in its entirety. So basically prove that this does nothing. But if you prove that nothing happens, then how is a judge supposed to weigh the debate? Because nothing happens on either side. You sanction Russia, you don't sanction Russia, nothing happens. So most debates try to claim an impact. So don't run an argument going, well, this doesn't do anything. Because maybe this doesn't do anything, but what's the impact of that argument? So impacts are different to responses, and delineating between them is kind of important. So like, don't run an argument going, this doesn't end the war. Because if you run an argument going, this doesn't end the war, then yes, the war might not end, but there's no impact on either side. And in those situations, the judges are likely to just give it to affirmative, because like, maybe you're able to prove this doesn't end the war, but maybe there's a very small likelihood that it might end the war. And so on like the smallest margins, you might give it to affirmative because there's no impact I can weigh against the more credible impact coming from affirmative. Make sense? Okay. The last is flip. I think the analogy for a flip comes from the flipping a table phrase. But basically, what happens is that you have an argument on. You have an argument on one side, and you just say, no, it's actually just worse on the other side. So if you think about an argument as an affirmative team, if something is above the table, it's an argument for affirmative. If it's below a certain axis, it might be an argument for negative. If you flip it, you're basically saying, this is actually something we're able to claim in the debate, not something that the other side is able to claim. Yes. I got Gemini Pro a few days ago and I'm just like having fun with it. Okay, let's take an example. This house believes that the Netherlands should allow citizens to purchase additional votes from other citizens. Ignore the context of the Netherlands. This is a world's motion, so there's like some unique reason for why the motion is space set in.
It's probably because the
Those-
world champion is in Netherlands because
I don't know. I'm not sure why it's set in Netherlands, but let's take a very basic argument that you might be able to run from affirmative. Let's say you say this reduces. Sorry, what?
Reduces
Wait, what? Sorry, no, this. What? Oh, sorry. It's supposed to say reduces inequality.
inequality. No.
No.
Very interesting.
Alright, let's say you're affirmative. You say this reduces inequality because poor people can now sell their votes and make money. Negative can say, well, no, it actually worsens inequality for these reasons. First, intuitively, rich people are the most likely to buy their votes, or buy votes from other people. There are 4 reasons for this. I'm not going to go through these 4 reasons. Have fun reading them. Then you can prove that when rich people have outsized influence on the voting system by virtue of them having more votes than poorer people, they're able to promote policies in the interest of those individuals as opposed to the interest of poor people. This obviously requires you to then prove why the interests of poor people and rich people often diverge from one another and why you can't have both at the same time. But we did all of this last week when I explained this. The important thing about a flip is that a flip is essentially an argument for your side. Even though it's often phrased as a response, it is in essence an argument, which means all the same analytical burdens that you would impose on an argument apply on a flip. So proving the analytical chain, how you get from point X to point Y. For example, this exacerbates inequality. How do you get from being able to sell votes to exacerbating inequality? You still need to fill in both holes there. So maybe you say, I guess the claim here is that rich people would buy this. So first you need to prove why rich people are the most likely to buy this. Then you need to prove why rich people having a bunch of votes is bad. So why is this harmful? So the 2 burdens to the argument are still necessary and you need to fulfill them. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Alright. Weighing. We've done a lot of like weighing. I guess I've talked a bit about weighing over the last few weeks. Just because I genuinely think like most debates are just a question of weighing. Like it's rarely the case that you end up in a debate where nothing one team says is true and everything another team says is like true. Like most teams say things that are probably true. It's just you need to prove why the claim that you're making is more important than the claim that the other side is making. And weighing just helps you do that. This is where responses are important. Responses like downsize the other team's impact so that your impacts can override it. But the important thing you need to remember is that while you're responding to an argument, don't get lost in the granular details to the extent that you forget what the big point or what the big picture goal of that speech is. So your goal in a speech as a second or third speaker perhaps is to try and prove why your case is more important than another team's case. If you just like give 20 responses to affirmative, but you never position those responses in the debate, I don't know what your responses are doing, right? So you need to be very clear about what the what your arguments and what your material in the debate is doing. More like debate term for this is what we call meta commentary. So you're like, well, this responds to this argument, which then allows our argument on this to be more important because of this. So just like be more cognizant of what the bigger picture goal is. You're not responding to an argument in isolation. You're trying to prove why it is more important or less important than another argument. In the same way, when you're responding to rebuttals, make it clear what those responses do. If the other team has just attempted a flip on your argument, you're in a pretty precarious position because now you need to be able to respond to that argument in order to take out the positive material on their side. In those situations, like be very clear. Then be like, well, this is no longer a flip. We're still able to claim the bulk of this benefit, which outweighs all of the benefits that you're able to get at affirmative, even if you believe them. Washing. Okay, I'm rushing through this, but that's just because I think we went over time on presentations. Washing is basically using uncertainty in a debate to your benefit. So in a debate, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty on either side. That is partly because that is partly because like teams might be able to claim reasons why something is true on either side, right? So they might say, well, this benefits the economy, this benefits the economy, and both teams might be trying to vie for the same impact, or in the same claim, or trying to vie for the same outcome in that like contention point. In those situations, what you're able to do very cleanly is just wash out the question. So I don't know where the term washing comes from, but I think it comes from like power washing, if I'm not mistaken. Someone explained it to me in that sense a few years ago, which is just that you take out the argument and take out that question from the debate entirely. You can be like, well, there are plausible reasons why this policy might either benefit poorer people, or why this policy might exacerbate harm for poorer people. This probably isn't the crux of this debate because there's relative uncertainty on either side. You can't adjudicate this fairly. The more important question in this debate is about signaling. So let's now win on the question of signaling. This is a very easy way for closing teams to be able to position themselves in a debate as well. You can say both top half teams wash each other out. Here's how we're going to win by proving the more important impact that's more certain, because everything in top half is pretty uncertain. So using uncertainty to your benefit is what we call washing. Make sense?
Not really.
Bruh. Thanks.
Alright, that's fine. So, okay, Scarlett, you ran an argument in your speech which was this helps exposure to indigenous communities, right? Or indigenous culture or something like that, right? If you're able to prove that this worsens, or let's say negative is able to prove that as a result of polarization, you're going to have worse indigenous relations or less indigenous cultural exposure for whatever reason, then you can stand up as a closing team and be like, the question of whether or not indigenous culture propagates as a result of elders doing this is pretty nebulous and not that important in this debate, because there are plausible reasons why this might either facilitate the spreading of that culture, but also reasons why this might harm the spreading of that culture. The more important question in this debate is safety. So we're just going to win on the question of safety, cleanly taking out both top half teams. Does that make sense? So you're just inserting uncertainty in the debate. You're just saying, well, this question is pretty uncertain because both sides have a plausible claim to it in top half. At closing, we're just going to prove a more important impact that is less uncertain. Make sense? It's a very common introduction to a speech that you might see.
It's a shame that this slide doesn't have another upholding Gemini picture.
I kind of gave up on them halfway through. I just thought they took away from time. Okay, let me try and think. Let me try and come up since we have a bit of time. One more thing I want to chat about. Even if. Sorry, I didn't add this to the slideshow. I'll probably do it in the final one. The even if. Let me just do this. Even if. Okay.
Is it a bit late?
I didn't think I'd get time, but thankfully I have time to do this.
Nothing
Okay.
has changed.
Even if analysis is basically responding at a higher level than a normal response would deal with an argument, you're saying even if you believe, so there are a few ways you can respond to an argument, right? You can respond to it either on the question of likelihood, or you can respond to it on the question of importance. You can say first give responses on likelihood, supposedly. And then say, even if you don't buy these sets of responses and you think affirmative is able to claim the desired impact, I'm now going to prove why this impact is not that important in the debate. So you're just saying, here's why their argument doesn't work. Even if you believe their argument works, here's why the impact they're going for doesn't mean much. It's just like a higher level response. Because now they need to respond to both things. They need to respond to both why the likelihood of their argument still remains, but also why their argument is important. So you just place a higher burden on the other side. Make sense?
It's kind of like a counterclaim.
Not exactly. It's responding at a higher burden. So you're not just responding to why an argument is true or not true. You're responding to why an argument is, even if you believe true, not that important in the debate. So you can take it out at two levels, right? Let's go back here. A nullification is basically trying to get the area under this square to be 0. There are two ways you can do this. You can either reduce the likelihood, at which point it's a line. So even if they have a very high impact argument that's very unlikely, then the area under that square is 0. But similarly, you can also just reduce the impact of the argument. So even if they prove an argument is very likely, or the most likely argument in the world, if they don't prove it is important, what does the argument do in the debate? Nothing. So you can respond and mitigate both on the question of likelihood and importance. Impact. Works? Alright. Uh, let me try and find that speech. Give me a second.
Which one? The 2020?
Yes.
No, it's a one made.
I can't.
Yeah, obviously it's a 205 line.
It's actually 2020.
I can't remember where this speech has swearing.
Did you know that papaya
Watch you go debate in the future.
Did you know the papaya backwards is iopop? In iopop in ancient Greek doesn't mean anything because it isn't a word in ancient Greek.
no way. He's a genius.
Give me a second, because I don't remember where this speech has swearing in it, so I should just make sure that it doesn't.
Could be a major. It could be a major in linguistics.
I mean, wait, are you allowed to have like bad words in the speeches?
What do you mean bad?
Like, I'm swearing and stuff.
Ooh, actually, I think it depends.
I think it depends. Because
I mean, obviously, don't try it over here. You gotta get your ass.
I mean,
Let's like keep it PG-15. like look at the circumstances. If it's like in a whole of adults, like gambling around during.
No.
There's no for it.
Because in first year, it's like 2015 WEC he said a very, very bad word in his introduction. And it slided forward.
Slide.
Oh. Yeah, sliding.
Slide. The perfect tense.
You know that slided. You know that slider is not word. Slider is not word.
Alright,
Jump.
let's go to the.
Why does it look like it's in the small?
I don't know why the recording for this is pretty bad. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Because YouTube.
What?
might be.
Ronald 360. I don't know.
Bro, it looks like he steals children.
Oh no.
What?
Why is this?
How he did ass.
I don't think the speech has swearing. I'm pretty sure. it
Okay.
doesn't. But let's see.
With zero explanation of the long-term benefit, our piece is simple. When the West intervenes, what you get is Somalia all over again. The West intervenes for 6 months. You temporarily increase violence. The West then leaves as the body bag effect kicks in. The resulting increase in violence, the increased power for radical Islamist groups to seize influence across the country means the genocide gets worse.
Sorry, I forgot to tell you the motion. The motion is this House would militarily intervene in Sudan. For those of you who don't know what's going on in Sudan right now, you have a humanitarian crisis, you have a civil war in the country.
Opening government is right. There is an epic humanitarian crisis in Sudan. That crisis gets worse on their side of the House. Do not let the rhetoric fool you. First question, when the intervention succeeds, opening government, they're all silly. Reason number one, terrain in Sudan is favorable for intervention. Nonsense. There are 2 places where the conflict...
That's a nullification. You're basically saying the argument means nothing. But opening government's claim is that intervening in Sudan is possible because the terrain in Sudan facilitates for a pretty easy intervention. Ryan responds by saying, well, no, this isn't true because the majority of the conflict is isolated in urban areas where it's pretty hard for you to do this.
Currently happens. The first are major urban centers like Khartoum and Port Sudan. Problem: urban warfare is notoriously impossible. If you don't trust me, ask the people in Stalingrad in 1944 how they felt about urban conflict. Why is this warfare difficult? Because the precision airstrikes that Manuel wants to prop do not work in urban areas. Hint, you know what happens when you try to do precision airstrikes? You get Gaza, mass humanitarian civilian casualties because you cannot target specific sites. You lack intelligence about where forces are operated, which means civilian casualties get worse on their side of the house, which not only means you don't displace the RSF, you kill civilians in the process. Secondly, the violence is often occurring in underdeveloped rural areas in Darfur. The problem is that these areas are low population density zones. That means in order to create opening government's humanitarian corridors, you need a huge mass of peacekeepers. Tens of thousands.
The speech is good, you guys can go watch it later. The point is that you can nullify responses even in pretty high quality debates. I'm just trying to find the flip, because there was a flip.
Scale of intervention. At best what you get is what Haiti is currently before. It is now January of 2025. There are fewer than 1 benefit, because they want this to be a unit that can only be defensive in nature. The problem is you must will to justify the militaries that the major African militaries that quit back CF, the Cuban militaries that screw administration for the government.
Bro, he's striking.
I have actually no idea where the flip is. But there is a flip in this speech which basically responds to an argument that the other side is making in 4 different ways and says why it's actually worse on their side. This is a pretty good speech. It's a good masterclass of not just mitigating but also nullifying and flipping. So you can nullify and flip in high quality rules. The problem is just it's incredibly hard in the majority of situations, just because the quality of arguments that the other team is making are in many cases like true. This isn't true in situations when both teams are trying to go for the same impact, right? So obviously the claim that both teams are trying to make in this debate is that the humanitarian crisis in Sudan becomes less worse and the severity of the crisis goes away. But obviously, in that situation, you can't just be like, well, the other side is right, because both of you are trying to go for the same impact in that debate. In those questions, in those sorts of debates, what you need to be able to do is respond and flip the arguments. But there are other forms of debates where you have different arguments that both teams are making. Melbourne calls this like 2 cakes versus 1 cake debates. I don't know why we use the analogy, but basically, debates can be categorized into 2 different kinds. The first are debates when both teams are trying to go for the same impact. So both teams are trying to claim that the crisis in Sudan gets less bad. Okay. The second are debates when they're trying to go for different impacts, and then in those debates you weigh those impacts against each other. So there are either 2 questions in the debate or there is 1 question in the debate. The 2 questions would be whatever you're going for, whether it's true, or whether the other side, whatever they're going for is true, or whether you guys are both going for the same impact, at which point which team proves their impact better.
So
Make sense?
you're fighting for 2 pieces of cake and see which one is heavier, or you fight for 1 piece of cake.
Yeah, I guess that's the way to think about it. So you're either fighting for 1 piece of cake or 2 pieces of cake. The majority of debates in my experience are debates about 2 cakes, just because like it is just the case that there are different issues in the debate that like teams are able to prioritize. And oftentimes CA teams set motions with the intention of there being different issues that you can either win or lose on. So in those situations, that's where mitigating is more important than I guess nullifying or flipping. So if you can try to think of a nullification, think of a nullification. If you can think of mitigation, think of mitigation. A good way to respond is just layering your responses. So give mitigations, nullify and flip if you can. So the best response is probably, first I'm going to flip their argument in 2 ways. Let's assume you don't buy the flip. Even if you don't buy that, their argument is bogus. Here's how I'm going to nullify 3 ways. Then mitigate. Then you just have like a bunch of responses that you've laid against everything that the other side has been able to say. So try to do everything. Don't get too honed in purely on don't get too honed in on nullification. And if you can't think of a nullification, that's fine as long as you're able to mitigate as well. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Let me come up with a motion.
I'm going to use that. Oh, what is the side called?
This guy should be adjudicator.
I'm not
He's
adjudicator.
too-
Yeah,
he's- Yeah, because he's too
No, but we
good.
have a
It's
perfect
not
example.
fair.
No,
It's not fair.
Oh, yeah. Actually, if we get in the team together, we should be fine, shouldn't we?
Real.
Yeah.
He's my brother, so I get rights to him first.
Rights to it.
Alright, right.
You have rights.